There is very limited information on the prevalence of psychiatric disorders in the Indigenous population in Canada, and indeed in most places in the world. Part of this is just the limited number of studies. Part of this is the reluctance of the communities to be assessed this way. And the older psychiatric epidemiology that was done often just used symptom checklists, which gives you just a very crude sense of the level of distress in a community, which can't distinguish different types of disorders and can't distinguish a broader kind of distress that you could call social suffering from specifically mental health problems or psychiatric problems. So as a result, the thing we probably know the most about is suicide attempts and deaths by suicide. Deaths by suicide do get recorded in most jurisdictions by a coroner, so you have some kind of count. It may not be accurate, but it's relatively solid data. Suicide attempts get recorded usually either through specific surveys, sometimes through healthcare records because people come to medical attention. But in fact, many people who make a suicide attempt may never come to medical attention or may go to the doctor but not declare that that was something that just happened. They may come and talk about something else. So usually that requires specific surveys. There have been surveys that have looked also at levels of substance use, and the popular portrait of Indigenous people is that they have very high levels of substance use problems. Alcohol, other kinds of drug abuse, and so on. To the extent that there's a kind of popular media cultural stereotype of the drunken Indian kind of, as somebody that is a prevalent social stereotype and image in the community. And in fact, in Canada, in terms of health services, for a long time, the major mental health services available to people were substance use related services. So we had a national alcohol and drug abuse program that was funding community workers that would help people with substance use problems. And in fact, what's happened nationally is that people involved with substance use and people involved with mental health have kind of been separate camps to some degree, which seems very odd and arbitrary given the fact that these things are intertwined and that the same people are often suffering from different kinds of problems. The little bit of data we have does show that the overall rates of distress are higher in many communities than they are in the general population. How much the problem of suicide can be directly linked to specific psychiatric problems, depression, other things, remains contentious. Because suicide, in the end, is not a mental disorder, it's a behavior. And the question is, many things could cause suicide. An existential crisis could cause suicide. So kind of trying to unpack that and say what's the relationship to things like depression or to other problems is important. There have been a number of surveys that have looked at, again, mainly general distress and substance use. And there are higher prevalences of some kinds of substance use and alcohol use in some communities. There also are higher rates of people who are teetotalers, that is, people who don't drink at all in these same communities. And so you can view that partly as a reaction or as an alternative path that people are following. But I think it's important to know that to avoid this sort of global stereotype of understanding of what's going on for people. So the challenge has been how to understand the types of problems people are having and their link, as we were just talking about, their link to the past and to the current context. The slides that I'm just showing you briefly without really commenting on them right now are just older data of the type that we've had from Quebec. And we don't have very good data, for example, of the rates of major depressive disorder in any community because people have generally not used things like a structured diagnostic interview that would give you that kind of thing. We did do a survey in Nunavut, a household survey some years ago, using the depression module of the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, and that showed mildly elevated rates of depression, not at a level that would explain the increase in suicide. So the dilemma again is how to understand higher rates of suicide when there may or may not be higher rates of depression. So I'm going to say a little bit now about the problem of suicide, which we've done some work on and other people have done work on, so there's a bit more to look at and to think about. And as I said, suicide is a particular behavior or action, deliberately trying to end your own life, and therefore it reflects to some degree a mental representation or an idea. That is, you're trying to do something, you have a model of what you're trying to do, and it's an action that you're carrying out. So that's different than measuring a symptom, let's say, that is involuntary in a sense, and it's something that you might expect would be shaped by cultural models and expectations to some degree. Having said that, most studies of suicide in the general population show that 70 to 90% of people who die by suicide had a diagnosable psychiatric illness. Most often major depression, but also alcohol or drug abuse. And if you include those as psychiatric disorders, then there's a very high prevalence of those among people with, who die by suicide. This is what the pattern looked like. This is now getting on 20 years ago, but it's not very different right now. In terms of the rates of suicide of the general population and First Nations for males and females. And you see the enormous discrepancy in Canada with the general population. And what you also see, in fact, is that, in fact, for older groups, in the general population, it's somewhat older people who have a slightly higher rate of suicide. Whereas on the Indigenous population, it's young people, particularly the 15 to 24 age range. In fact, it even goes younger than that. And you see an elevation both in males and females, but a much higher elevation for males. And in fact, in the Indigenous population, it may be that the rate for older people is lower than the general population. And that might be because if you survive long enough to be old, you are, healthier, better shape. It also may represent to some degree a generational effect. So what is the context in which these suicides are occurring? We're thinking about the situation for young people. This is a photo of a home in Labrador. And you see the context of people sitting around, they're watching TV. In the foreground is a dead caribou on the ground from a hunt, and a Fisher-Price child's toy. So I think this captures well the sort of intermixing of cultural moments and cultural influences in people's everyday lives for young people. And this also captures it well. A young man, again in a similar home and environment, watching a shuttle take off on TV. So even in very remote communities where people are living in very materially limited circumstances in some ways, they have access to a kind of global culture and an awareness of other things. And that creates a very special situation. It's very different than living in an enclosed community where your frameworks and your value system and your expectations are somehow calibrated to what's possible and what's available around you. Here you have a situation where what's around you and what you see on TV may be wildly divergent. And so the ideals and the goals and the hopes and the aspirations and your sense of what's cool and interesting and so on may be quite different than what is immediately available to you. So this is one of the points I was making earlier that I think we have to consider when you're thinking about young people, people in their early teens to their late teens and young adulthood, time of life for most of us where people have the maximum amount of energy and sort of desire to get engaged with things, and when the range of options that's available is extraordinarily important to sort of channel that energy. Because if you take people at that maximum of energy and you say, sorry, there's nothing important for you to do, nothing useful for you to do, limited options, you're creating a kind of collision between the energy that's available and the very limited possibilities for channeling it. And in that context, what you see are situations here of a young man who's sniffing solvents. You have a very significant problem in many communities of solvent abuse. particularly among preteens and into early teenage years. So before kids have easier access to alcohol and to other substances, things like paint thinner and glue and everything else are around all the time because of people, building and fixing and whatever, gasoline, and that becomes a substance of choice for kids who themselves are facing, if you ask them why, what's going on, they certainly have pain in their lives, but often they'll just describe it as getting high and they're experiencing the kind of spacing out that you get from these things. And it may be somewhat social in the sense that kids will do it together. But these are often kids whose parents have a lot of pain and a lot of problems. So again, the transgenerational process is going on both from one generation to the next and then laterally from one set of kids who are suffering to another set of kids who are part of a kind of subculture. We've mentioned already that the problem of suicide is a relatively recent problem. We don't know what the levels of suicide were in the remote historical past. We can figure out that they were not high because people were surviving in relatively small populations for a long period of time. If they had a lot of suicide, they would be wiped out. There is a popular media portrayal of the Inuit in particular as having a kind of easy suicide or altruistic suicide. This appears in movies, ethnographic things, and ethnographic records. The idea that somehow an Inuit person would decide that their life was no longer worth living or that they were old and enfeebled and they would just, throw themselves out of the boat into the water and so on. And so that led to a kind of notion that somehow suicide was easy for people in that context that you found in some accounts. Our own take on this literature is that it's a bit of a distortion again of what's going on, that there were certainly times, historical times, when people were facing famine, when families were in desperate situations, where there would be an altruistic statement by an elder like, I understand you can't carry me anymore right now, literally because you've got to go hunting. Leave me here and come back and get me later if you can. And with great sorrow and grief, the family might agree because it was a matter of life and death at that point. So I wouldn't call that an easy suicide, even if people had to do things like that at the limits of existence. That kind of suicide, though, that is described a little bit in the historical record, and people talk about that, is completely different. That's an old, ill person or someone else who's become a burden on the small group that's trying to survive under very difficult circumstances, where they would go out of their way to try to maintain the person, but finally kind of reaches a breaking point, and there's some selfless act by somebody for the sake of their children and their grandchildren. That's a very different, I'm not even sure that that's really should be called suicide. If you're selflessly sacrificing yourself for someone else, I'm not sure that's exactly what we mean by suicide. In any event, that kind of desperate decision in that moment is completely different from a young person, supposedly at the prime of life, suddenly killing themselves. And as you see, this is a phenomenon. I started working, this is Nunavut, I think I have the same slide here. This is Nunavik where I worked. I started working in the late 80s, early 90s. And you see that the attempts to provide basic psychiatric care had no positive impact on a process that was probably already in motion as it was in other places and just sort of inexorably unfolding over time despite lots of efforts and repeated calls to we must do something and so on and so forth. So this is a historical, broad social process. We have to try to understand what's going on, kind of. It's true in other places. So this is now a group, First Nations peoples in Ontario. And you see a similar kind of a pattern. And where this change has occurred over time is in this young group. So there you can see three periods. The blue line is 1980, and then 1989 is the black line, and then 1999, in each case a several year period in the red. So you see that this is really unfolded at a certain point in time. There's lots of fluctuations. When you're looking at these figures, it's important to realize suicide rates or deaths by suicide are usually reported per 100,000. If you have a community of 1,000 people and they have one death, they have 100 per 100,000. It's only one person who died. That's a very high rate of suicide. So it can be quite distorting, and also it means not only is it hard to generalize from like the proportion in a small community, it may be an unstable figure, it's also going to be very unstable from year to year. One year you have 2 suicides, you have an astronomical number, next year you have none, oh now you have 0. So it has to be averaged over time. So here you can see the fluctuations in Nunavik in northern Quebec over time, and then the sort of averaged line, which does show you that there's this trend of people dying by suicide going up. We've also looked at suicide attempts. Now, attempted suicide and death by suicide are slightly different issues. To some degree, it's a severity issue, because if you make a more lethal attempt, you're more likely to die. But there's also an area of non-overlap in the sense that there are people who clearly make multiple non-lethal attempts. That they're more, cries for help or angry gestures that are not organized in the same way as a very clearly lethal attempt. So in suicide research, people often say you should treat these as 2 separate issues and try to understand the determinants of death by suicide and the determinants of suicide attempts, because there's some non-overlap in those populations, even though there certainly are people who will make multiple attempts and eventually die, and so on. There are plenty of people who die by suicide who never made a previous attempt. So their first attempt was a highly lethal attempt. You may notice the language I'm using. Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention advocates that we should not talk about people succeeding at suicide or completing suicide, but we should say die by suicide. I'm trying to avoid imputations both of motivation and of success versus failure, because it's very paradoxical to use that language in this context. So trying to use language more deliberately to encourage us, first of all, to think clearly, but also just in terms of having a more positive effect on the language of suicide, and so that we don't inadvertently normalize certain things that we want people to understand as a health problem that they should be concerned about. This is over the period that I was working in Nunavik, and surveys were done, and again you see this dilemma of an increase in suicidal ideation and in suicide attempts for the most part. So we have one thing, a couple of things we have to explain now. Why is it young people? Why is it young males? Why is it increasing in recent years? And then finally, why is it in some places and not others? So here's the rate of suicide in different communities in Nunavut, and you see the huge variation. Now some of this is just the problem that I said earlier, that these are small communities. So if you look at 300-400 people, it's quite likely that one year there might not be one, another year there might be some, but you do see enormous variation. So this is a caution again about making generalities. In the general population, when you look at people who die by suicide, you can find a very high prevalence of psychiatric diagnoses. The way that this is usually done, since people have died, is by reviewing their records, but also by doing what's called a psychological autopsy or a follow-back study. You can't interview the people to diagnose them, so what you do is you interview people who knew them well, and you try to reconstruct as carefully as you can what might have been going on, and you can even do like a structured diagnostic interview by proxy. So rather than asking the person directly, did you ever have, et cetera, you're asking somebody who knew them. And typically you try to find at least 2 people, one a family member who would know their development well and other things, and the other a peer who would know things like whether they were using alcohol or drugs, which maybe their family's not the right person to ask, but you would find that from a close friend who would probably be able to tell you more of that. And what you do in a systematic study is you have your group of people who died by suicide that you analyze that way, and you create a control group or comparison group of people who are the same age, who are still alive, and who you interview, not them, but the same kind of people. So you don't find out the answer from them directly, because that would not be a fair comparison. You find out what their parents know and what their friend knows, and you use those to compare. So these are the results from a study, it's not yet published, that was done in Nunavut on all the people who died over a 5-year period by suicide. So I forget what it is now, it's into the hundreds, the number of people here, and comparisons. And what you can see is that there are high rates of psychiatric diagnoses that can be reconstructed. Major depressive disorder is the first one, that's the most common. Use of cannabis is common. And having more than one problem, mainly of major depressive disorder and cannabis, but sometimes other things, is also common. Now, how important cannabis is in this story, I don't know. Probably not very important because it's used socially and many, many people are using this. I'm not sure how severe this is contributing, a problem contributing to people, although since it probably interferes with things like school and other things, if you're a heavy cannabis user, at the very least it's an indicator, a marker of somebody having troubles of another kind. Major depressive disorder, we think, is more intimately connected to suicide because it makes people feel despair and hopeless and so on, and that's going to be a direct input into that. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, now I want to go back to the thing I showed you before. So this is this notion of if we think in terms of psychiatric diagnoses, we're looking for individual characteristics that can explain why one person dies and another person doesn't. And that, in this case, we're saying, okay, so certain people are depressed, or certain people are using substances, and this is making them prone to be suicidal in certain other situations, which I'll get to in a moment. At the same time, as I mentioned, there are these broader differences across communities. And something that really impressed me when I began working in the North was I saw one kid after another who made a suicide attempt. And I began to feel very early on that looking at this as an individual process is somehow missing an important dimension. How can there be so many kids who are suffering this? There must be something in the larger context that explains that. And so then when you look across communities, you find this variation. And indeed, if you look in other contexts. So this is now data from Michael Chandler, a psychologist in British Columbia, where there are many different indigenous communities, many different nations, different peoples, different languages, and so on. This is in fact grouping 80 or so different First Nations by language grouping. So they've got 11 different language groups here. And you can see that the rate of suicide varies widely across these communities. And these numbers are a little more meaningful now because you're lumping together lots of different communities. So the numbers are an average, and it's probably a little bit more stable than just talking about one community. And so you've got another puzzle here again. You're saying, okay, it is a social phenomenon. There are some communities that are having quite high levels, but other communities are not. What could be going on? So Michael Chandler is a developmental psychologist originally. He trained with Jean Piaget, among others, and his interest has been in the notion of continuity of the self. He became very interested in the idea that how is it that children know that they are the same person from day to day, week to week, month to month, when in fact they're changing all the time. You go from being a small person to a large person, and you change in so many ways. So how is it we know we're the same person? And he developed this whole paradigm where he would give children stories of transformation. And one of the stories he would give older children is A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where you have Ebenezer Scrooge is this terribly miserly guy, and then he has all these experiences of the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future comes to him and shows him the terrible effects of all his actions, and he becomes a new man, a kind man at the end of the thing. So they would read children the story, and then they would say, okay, is he the same person at the beginning and the end? And even very young children will say, oh yes, of course, he's the same person. And then they say, well, how do you know? So it's not simply whether you know it's the same person. We all know it's the same person pretty much, unless we're really having more serious problems. But the question is, how do you warrant that kind of continuity? So it turns out that how you warrant continuity undergoes a developmental trajectory. And young children tend to give very concrete explanations, as you might expect from a kind of Piagetian perspective. So they say, oh, well, he has the same clothes, or he has the same name, or he lives in the same place, or something like that. And as people get older, they give more and more sophisticated accounts that eventually become a kind of narrative account. Well, who he is really a story, his memory of the past and his sense of who he is, and he keeps incorporating these elements into that story so he understands that he's the same person. I mean, that's a very sophisticated notion of identity that would be shared with psychologists nowadays and so on. And by the time people are in their adolescence, late adolescence, they can usually give an account somewhat like that. So that was interesting work that he did on its own right, purely developmentally. Then what he did was he had this fortuitous finding by looking at adolescents who were hospitalized for suicidality and comparing them to adolescents who were hospitalized for other problems like anorexia nervosa or some other problem, but who were not suicidal. And he showed that the suicidal adolescents seemed to have a deficit in this ability to warrant continuity. So that's a kind of interesting idea, because it says, could it be that suicide is partly related to this inability to see a continuity of yourself from past to present and into the future? Because then it makes it easy for you to end your life. If you don't have any sense that you have a future, you're going to go on, you can imagine a future, and you can connect those. So that was an interesting bit of work that he did that I think is provocative and that helps us to think a bit about suicide in a slightly different way. But for our purposes, what's interesting is he then, inspired by that idea, when looking around at the problems of indigenous people in British Columbia, he decided to do a study with Chris Lalonde, a colleague, in which he collected information about what he called cultural continuity. Because he said, well, what if you have this problem of warranting, of creating, constructing in your mind a sense of your own personal continuity, in a traditional society, that is to say a society with a small, closely knit, where there are well-defined roles and transitions for people, you're going to be taken in hand by other people and told, okay, now you're 15, it's time for you to become an adult in society, here is our rite of initiation, here's our thing we're going to do, and now you have this role in our society. You take part in the religious celebrations, or you take part in this and that, and you have a meaningful role. And in fact, historically, people in their teens, in most small-scale societies, became very active members of their societies. They were not adolescents, still had to go to school to learn how to be an adult. Biologically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, mid to late teens, we're ready to be full members of society, even if we're kind of on the impulsive side, most of us. So, and there's a role for that too in society, to be the impulsive one who tries new things, who takes risks on behalf of the society, et cetera, who can be the warrior, who can do the other things that need to be done for the group at that stage, if the group knows the right job to put the person to. Of course, we don't do that. We tell adolescents, no, we have no use for you now, 5 more years of school, and if you're totally frustrated, you can go on the streets and protest. You could view that as a kind of, a kind of unused energy that should be channeled in creative ways, kind of. So what he hypothesized was, could it be that since so much has been done in the history that I talked about to sort of undermine these traditional forms, rites of initiation, everything else that existed in these societies, in fact, in the past, that you have an interaction now between people who are vulnerable on the one hand, because almost any developmental thing that makes it hard for you to mature might put you at risk in some ways, and if the society doesn't have ways of holding you, then you're at this double risk now. So could we look at the ways in which societies are maintaining continuity? So he took this idea of continuity of identity and sort of metaphorically transposed it to this level of cultural continuity. And then he said, what can we study with cultural continuity without having to collect new data? What can we find in the public record? So first of all, he could find coroners' records on rates of death by suicide, and then he could find various things about communities. Are you involved in self-government? Where are you in land claims, that is to say litigation to gain control of your traditional lands? Do you control your own education? Do you control your own health services in your community? Do you have cultural facilities for transmitting your culture in some way? Do you control your police and fire services? And he called all these cultural continuity. We'll come back to that in a moment. But these were things that he could measure about these communities. Oops, again, sorry. And when he plotted the rate of suicide, he made an index of adding up each of these things, and when he plotted that against the rate of suicide in these 80 communities in British Columbia, this is what he found. And it's a very dramatic finding. And basically, there's a very strong correlation, in effect, so that those communities that had all of these things had virtually no suicides, and those communities that had none of these things had an astronomically high rate of suicide. So this has become one of the single most widely cited papers in the whole area of Aboriginal health, because it has this very interesting policy implication, because you're linking population health to a community and in effect, a kind of political variable. So it has a lot of implications for advocacy and public health and so on. He then went on to replicate this, Chris Lalonde and Michael Chandler, with additional data, also in British Columbia, but with 5 more years of data, and with other variables. So these are other variables that are also associated with lower rates of suicide. And it's interesting because you can see, for example, women accounting for more than 50% of elected officials is associated. And the more you look at these, the more his label of cultural continuity becomes problematic in some ways. For example, in British Columbia, there are some societies that are matriarchal in the sense that women held power, but there are many societies in which women typically did not hold political power. So the idea of more than 50% of women holding political office is not exactly continuity, it's actually a kind of culture change. But when I've had discussions with him around this, he sort of says, well, but what real cultural continuity is anyway is constant change. It's not that you just hold on to the past like this, it's that your culture is evolving and adapting, and so there's a continuity. So you can still view it that way, that these are viable communities that are making adaptations they need to the modern context in a way, and that represents then a kind of vitality. I do think that there are other ways of looking at this. Specifically, that you can think of this as local control in some ways, that those communities that have more of their own local institutions are doing better. And there's a whole variety of other things, because this is simply a kind of correlational study. It's not a causal study. We don't really know what came first, and do all these variables just reflect something else about these societies that we have not measured or that we don't know. So there are many limitations to this kind of study, but it's still a very compelling piece of data, and there are some efforts underway to replicate this or to extend this to other contexts. So Crystal Lawn, he'd been working in Manitoba, another region of Canada where there are many different indigenous groups where you could do something a bit similar, but you have to look for, because the political contexts are different and so on, you have to look for other variables. It's clear that this kind of study would not work very well in Nunavut, where we have very high rate of suicide, where, as I showed you earlier, there is variation, but where, for example, there is now self-government. It's a whole, as I showed you at the beginning, this is a region that has its own government. It's very inspiring to see. It has not reduced the suicide rate. So there's more complex things going on. Now, one clue to what might be going on in Nunavut is pure speculation, but it has to do with the story that we thought about earlier around sedentarization, because Inuit society traditionally was very small scale, just extended families, one or two extended families moving around. The communities bring many different groups together in a very new way for which there is no traditional cultural form. And there are dilemmas about how much power is shared, how much people feel they have a stake in what's going on, and the fault lines, the tensions within communities tend to fall along family lines, clan lines, and unfortunately there tend to be haves and have-nots in this kind of situation. So you could speculate, it's pure speculation, that whatever the value is of a community feeling empowered, having local control and so on, it's going to have maximal impact on the whole cohort of youth if that is equally shared in some way, if people feel that they have some kind of connection to that, some kind of buy-in to that. Whereas if people feel that's quite distant from their own family or their own trajectory or their own possibilities, it may not be beneficial in the same way. There have been some studies. There are some very good case studies to show. For example, in the 60s, anthropologist Nelson Grayburn published a book called Eskimos Without Igloos, about Saluit, about the community that I showed you a photograph at the beginning, which, and I believe in the 60s, I believe it had a nickel mine nearby. And the effects of the mine on the community were fairly catastrophic. Because what happened was there was development of the mine, there were miners that came up to work there, there was a small amount of work available for people from the community, it was not skilled labor, and what flowed into the community was miners on a break looking for relaxation, lots of alcohol, lots of liaisons between people, lots of disruption of the culture in the community. And this is a major concern right now. We have in Quebec right now, the government has a vision for the development of the north, and there's going to be a lot more, and this is true across Canada, of course. We have a national policy like this as well, but very strongly in Quebec right now, a lot of hope and enthusiasm for developing the north. And the real dilemma is the history so far has shown that those kinds of development projects often not only do not benefit local communities, but they are extremely disruptive and often undermining. And the kinds of work and opportunities that are available for local communities tend to be low-level, unskilled jobs, and the sudden infusion of cash and so on does not usually have a good effect. Because unless you build infrastructure and you build pathways where people have a notion of a viable life ongoing, it's not a recipe for well-being. There are communities on the West Coast that are quite wealthy. Communities have done very well, again, because of natural resources, because of land claims, because of other things. Some communities have done well, and some communities, again, the sudden influx of money has been problematic. because there's no way to, no structure for putting that to good use in effect in the community. Yeah. Well, we're in the midst of this right now. You're talking about communities that have sort of rejected development in some way and try to stand up for that on various bases, including, sometimes the rejection is on the same terms, like, no, this is our land. If anybody's going to develop it, we're going to develop it, and we demand, financial compensation. Sometimes the arguments are not like that. They're non-materialistic arguments, as you described, where a person's saying, no, we have a different relationship to the land and we don't want to see this happen. What happened in the northern Quebec, again, there's been a lot of development in northern Quebec. Quebec is very rich in hydroelectric or hydrological resources, which have led to hydroelectric development. And the flooding that occurs for those creation of those dams and so on has a profound effect on transforming the landscape. And often a negative effect from the point of view of indigenous people, in that it displaces wildlife, it changes hunting patterns, it leaches substances from the ground, so you end up with like more mercury and other kinds of things going on. There's lots of effects. And so generally speaking, in the north, indigenous people have had ambivalent relationship to development and often have actively opposed development of certain kinds for those reasons, that it will have a catastrophic effect on the wildlife and on the environment, and they're very concerned about it. But as I say ambivalent. It's not ambivalent, the wrong word, but they see both sides, and they're always trying to figure out what will work in terms of, on the one hand, being able to gain resources and opportunities and build a viable ongoing way of life. On the other hand, not make a sort of deal with the devil such that you have the resources, but there's nothing left to maintain now. Your whole life has fallen apart because it's had all these unintended consequences. And it's also honestly hard for people all human beings, I think, to anticipate what the impact's going to be. These are very complex phenomena. You're intervening in a big ecosystem, and then there's all this chain reaction that nobody has really been able to fully think through. They do try to have environmental impact assessments and so on. They often have run all kinds of risks of bias because there's big stakes going on. Again, we have a government at the moment that's busy dismantling all the mechanisms for doing that kind of serious review of things because they believe in development at any cost. And we also have a problem that those evaluations often don't think enough about the social dimensions of development. That people are focused mainly, let's figure out the toxicology of doing this. That's important. We don't want to poison people in the environment, and let's figure out this and that. But what the more complex impact is on people's identity, on their way of life, on their well-being, is often not given enough assessment, I think. And so this is why I think there's a lot of hesitancy, if not outright opposition, on the part of indigenous people for these development projects. It also speaks to a different relationship to the land, and again, I'm going to come to that in a moment, because we tend to think of the land as a commodity. And the traditional ways for some indigenous peoples of thinking of the land is that the land is a living being. I had the experience in Australia of an Aboriginal thinker making the point at a meeting that we have to get back to our roots, we have to get back to our connection to the land. And so my first reaction would be, okay, this is about land claims and owning land. And then the next thing he said really impressed itself on me. He said, we need to be needed by the land. And that is actually a very profoundly different relationship to the land. I mean, it's not what it's not that we need the land, we need to be needed by the land. I mean, it gives the land agency, it talks about a reciprocal relationship. It's a very different way of thinking. So people didn't own land before Europeans came. That was not the relationship you had to the land. You were involved with the land, you were trying to be in some kind of reciprocal relationship with it, and so on. Now, having said that, I should say, I don't think that there's a romantic view of the ecological Indian that says people were in this beautiful, balanced relationship with the land, and we have to get back to that. The evidence is that that's not the case. The evidence is that people did overfish and overhunt, and they had this impact. Generally speaking, it was not catastrophic because they were very small populations. So it's not that people had it all finally worked out or knew exactly what to do to maintain everything. They were small enough that they weren't a blight on the land the way human populations can be now. However, they did have a value system that lends itself to a kind of thinking about what should that be. And now if we combine that value system with our greater ecological understanding now, surely we could come up with a better process. So I'm going to come back to that because I think it's one of the interesting dimensions. And it's important also in terms of where I want to end up today is sort of thinking about this in reciprocal terms. That is, we're talking about a population that has experienced a certain kind of violence against it, and we all have a moral obligation to look at that and to try to address that in some way and to repair that or to seek redress. So I want to give you a couple of illustrations of the sort of contextual issues around mental health and resilience that maybe, again, will help shed light both on the suicide problem but on the flip side, again, of why some communities are doing well, because we can frame the same question both ways. We can say, given the history that I gave you, given the marginalization of communities, given the dilemmas that they're facing, we might say, okay, it's understandable why young people are having problems. For young males, I think the issue is that if you look in the Inuit context, for example, in terms of a woman's role, a young girl's role, they are still playing the same role that they played 100 years ago or 500 years ago. That is, you have babies, you take care of babies, you take care of the household, you do all that stuff. Now you may have a baby very young, you may give that baby to an auntie, but you may still feel good about the fact that you had a baby. For a young man, what you would have done traditionally is you would have gone out hunting, and what you collected would be absolutely essential and vital for everybody. Everybody absolutely needed this to survive. It was a source of food, of housing, of clothing, of everything. Now, you can take money from welfare or from some other source to put gasoline in your skidoo, to go and do some hunting, to supplement your food with good food, healthy food, but it is not essential to how the economy functions, the cash economy, basically. It's to some degree outside that or marginal to that to some degree. So, and what's more, you're going through a school system that's not interested in teaching you how to be a hunter, that views that as not the point really. So there's a disconnection between what your grandfather does, or perhaps your father, and what you do. And so you're left with saying, okay, so where do I go with these things I'm learning in, my sort of school in this remote community? Where do I go? Well, I guess I should go to Cégep, which means going to Quebec City or Montreal or something. If you do that, if you do well enough in school to do that, you go into an environment that's radically different from where you are, and it's very hard to adjust to that new environment, like anybody coming from a very small town to the big city or whatever, but with added layers to that. And so it's very likely that you get very discouraged and demoralized and it breaks down and you just want to go back home. So, but then you're in a dead end because there are limited jobs or options available in these communities. Almost all the jobs that do exist are service jobs. That is, you can be a teacher or a social work, community worker. There's not much else. Those involve skills like communication skills, thinking about relationships that, again, traditionally are more in the woman's domain. Because again, if you think of traditional life, the women in the family would sit around, they do a certain amount of gathering of food, and then they would be making the clothing and cooking the food and whatever, and doing these domestic things and chatting all day long. The men would be out hunting, and hunting is an activity where often you have to be quiet because you'll scare away the animals. So it's not conducive, at least in the moment when you're really focused on the hunting, to having lots of conversation and socializing. So you do see these gender differences in sort of how verbal people tend to be. So there are all these little things, none of which by itself is determining things. You get lots of variation, lots of ways that people do things, but you can see how it could exert an influence such that the actual options available to people are mismatched with who they are and what they ordinarily would do. And I think that discontinuity in cultural roles and opportunities is more dramatic and more complete, in a sense, for young males. And I think that has a significant amount to do with what we're looking at. So I want to tell you a little bit, these are maps just of the different indigenous communities in Quebec, and the different colors represent different nations. And I'm going to give you some examples just from areas where we've worked. So the Inuit we've been talking about in Nunavik, the Cree just below that. In fact, the dividing line between the Inuit and the Cree is just the tree line. And then a little bit about Mi'kmaq and Mohawk. This is a Cree community some years ago in the summertime. And you see both cabins and tents. This is a community in the wintertime. And this is a summer camp. So this would have been more traditional life where people are out on the land, living together in close proximity with adorable children and having a strong communal life and celebrating, feasting together and so on. These are photographs from Adrian Tanner from the 60s and 70s working in Mistissini. And we looked at data some years ago from a Cree health survey in which there was a measure of psychological distress and looked for correlates of that. And what's interesting is two things that came out here. One of which is having a good relationship with the community. It's positively related to mental health. And the number of weeks that you spend in the bush is positively related to mental health. So this is interesting in the sense of what is it about going out on the land and spending time together that is conducive to mental health? Because people will tell you this. They'll say, I feel better when I'm out on the land. And some of this is a relationship to the environment, again, which many people could relate to. If you talk about this to people in Sweden, they'll all say, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I go off to my house and, in the country every chance I get. So this notion of connection to, a natural environment and fresh air and beautiful surroundings and so on. But there are other things going on. There are other things. There's a different form of social life that goes on in the bush. In the town, in the settlement, people are in their own houses and they're separated. In the encampment, people are much more closely interacting with each other. So can be a different form of community in that setting. So I think this begins to speak to this idea that there might be a different way of relating that's connected to life on the land that has been disrupted and transformed by sedentarization. We've been talking about the Inuit a bit. And actually, we've talked about these things here. What I wanted to come back to was this notion that we've been talking about of the ecocentric self. I'm contrasting the ecocentric self with the dominant model of the self in Western psychology, again, which we could call the individualistic self. The individualistic self, or the egocentric self, says basically who I am is who you see here, bounded by my skin. The center is over here where I think and watch, and I'm constructing my own life through my own activity and agency, and other people are agents like me, and everything else is just inanimate material to use to achieve my projects. So that's a kind of egocentric view. In contrast, the ecocentric view, the way that George Wenzel and Stairs described it years ago, was I am I and the environment. So there's a notion that there's an interdependence, and not just an interdependence with others as you would see in a sociocentric or communalistic view, but an interdependence with the environment. And I mentioned already this notion of the guy saying, I know this land of the coastline better than I know the palm of my own hands. It's a kind of physical intimacy. But it goes beyond that with the idea that you have a kinship with other beings. There's a wonderful film by an old NFB film called Cree Hunters of Mistissini, I think, where they show a young man shoots a caribou. A young Cree man shoots a caribou, and he discovers on when they get the caribou and slaughtering it that it was pregnant. And so they take a fetus out of the womb. And this is a bad thing because you've now really transgressed against the animals. You can understand in very concrete ecological terms why it's a bad thing. I mean, that was supposed to be the next generation of caribou, and you're sort of interrupting that. But it has a spiritual meaning as well. And so when that happens, there's a whole ritual for dealing with that. They actually take the fetus and they put it in the mouth of the mother to protect it, and they say prayers, and they melt snow over the mouth to give water to the mother and the fetus, so it'll have water to drink in the other world. So there's this very powerful sense again of respecting this animal as a sentient being and as a being that one has to have a respectful relationship with, so that it will allow itself to be caught and to be harvested and so on. So that's part of what I mean again by the ecocentric self, because there are non-human beings, non-human persons in the world that you must relate to in some way. More than that, there's also a notion that what you are made up of is these beings. The Inuit have a very strong sense of the notion, on the top right there is some caribou meat and some fish, very strong notion that when you eat country food, which means eating raw meat, that substance is becoming you. And that is the source of health. Years ago, when we were talking about doing a mental health campaign for people, they were saying, well, you have to, actually it wasn't mental health, it was a breastfeeding campaign. And so they were saying, well, you should just tell people that, this is the elders' advice, that if women eat raw meat, then the good stuff in the raw meat is in their milk, and that will make the babies good, and therefore that's how they will be healthy. So, and that's not just physical health, that's mental health. It's all of a piece. So this is a very different notion of, again, this is not that you're just consuming this for calories or something. This is your vital substance and your sense of energy and well-being. It's also, you really can't see this very clearly at all, can you, here? So I'll have to describe this to you. Maybe there's some polar bears at the top. This is a wall hanging that was made by an Inuit artist that used to hang in the Aboriginal Healing Foundation in Ottawa. The polar bears at the top. There's a narwhal here, it's a beautiful animal with a big horn. And you can't see where the human beings are in this very clearly. But they're, you really can't see it, but they're right over here. They're sitting in their kayaks. So I love showing this picture because I compare this to like Leonardo's, Vitruvian Man. Human beings are very small. It's a big world out there with big animal powers and big energies and storms and oceans and powerful animals, and we are this very small thing. When you tell that to a sort of Western individualistic person, they think, oh, these people must have terrible self-esteem problems. Don't they realize that they are masters of all they see, etc.? But there's really a different notion, and it's what my colleague, let me just try to find the right slide here. What my colleague Carla Jess Williamson has called a cosmocentric view, which is that human beings are a very small part of the cosmos, and our health and well-being depends on being in a good relationship to the cosmos. So here's this notion from Inuktitut, this word sila, which is the root of the word silavit, and it refers to all the following things: air, weather, intellect, knowledge, integratedness, wisdom, and the external. So I think for most Westerners, again, linking knowledge, wisdom, and the external is very puzzling. What do you mean? Isn't that something we do in our brains and through our own will and so on? So this is a real shift, and this is where the energy that gives everything intelligence and so on is present. And Carla tells a story. This came out, this discussion between her and I, sort of learned this from her when we were asked to comment on a little case study that Jane Briggs, the anthropologist I mentioned earlier who studied Inuit, wrote about, of a kind of extreme teasing among the Inuit. Part of Inuit child rearing, traditional Inuit child rearing, was that children up to the age of 4 or 5 were viewed as not yet having rationality. And so they're treated with lots of love and protection because they're just little, they're young, they're babies. But around 4 or 5, you start getting rationality and becoming more of a socially aware being. And at that point, one of the ways that you're socialized is by a lot of teasing. And the teasing sort of shows you what's socially appropriate. But the teasing to a non-Inuit ear can be very harsh. That's a very nice shirt you're wearing. Maybe I should kill you and take your shirt. Maybe that was a bit harsher than it, but they're close to that, some of the examples. So the chapter, the story that we were responding to was Jane Briggs tells some of this stuff, and then she says there was a Danish medical officer, this was in Greenland, the story she's telling, who heard this, and his reaction was, this is child abuse, we have to take the child away, you can't talk to a child that way. So we were asked to comment on this from a cultural point of view. So I had my own take that, I come from a family where there was not a lot of teasing, and I was a small family, so I'm always a bit startled and puzzled by teasing, but I have friends who come from big families where there's lots of teasing, so I had to work that out for myself. But what Carla's reaction to this was, oh yes, my aunties and everybody did this with me all the time. They would ask you questions that would puzzle you and that play with you, and it was for a certain purpose. I remember my auntie used to say to me, "Where are you? Where are you?" And I was looking. I had to come up, and finally I would say this kind of, and her auntie would laugh. And the point, she says, was she was trying to teach me that I'm just this very small thing in this larger world. So the function of teasing is not only to socialize you, to sort of learn to deal with aggression and contain it and be appropriate and so on, but also to give you a realistic view of your place in the cosmos, not this inflated view. So this is an interesting dimension also of this ecocentric view that includes this other dimension I'm calling cosmocentric, because I think it's not just a social dimension at all now or environmental dimension, it's really a kind of vertical dimension. We'll talk about this more next time, because I'm going to come back to this idea of concepts of the person in relationship to kinds of psychotherapy and kinds of interventions. This whole issue of how this stuff gets transmitted is interesting, and this also changes over time, obviously. It's a picture of a young Inuit boy and an older man. This man, actually, who died some years ago, is Tomasi Humak. He's the Inuit Noah Webster. He wrote the first Inuktitut to Inuktitut dictionary. And he knew thousands of words that some of which younger people didn't know, that were being lost. And part of the reason is there's a very rich vocabulary in Inuktitut, for example, related to the hunt and to different parts of the animal. When you butcher the animal, you learn a lot of intimate anatomy of all these animals, and there you know the names of all these parts. And some of those names are also used for other things. So the first seal that you catch, traditionally, you might give certain different parts to certain people, to certain elders and people in your family, and though that relationship might also be called by that part. So a vocabulary that seemingly is a technical vocabulary about anatomy and the hunt and whatever, also is a social vocabulary for talking about relationships. So you see what you begin to lose if you're not involved with the hunt. You're losing this set of metaphors that could be used to talk in a nuanced way about other kinds of relationships, aside from actually losing some of those bonds that are enacted through that process. He's standing, not only did he write this dictionary, he's actually standing holding a soapstone sculpture in the middle of the museum in Inukjuak that he helped to found. They took the old, what was supposed to be like a case populaire, and they turned it into a museum when he was the key person in making that happen. And he's doing this, I got this photo at a time when CBC was up there filming him about his museum. And he's holding soapstone sculpture, so the other thing to say about that is that Inuit are famous for this kind of sculpture, and you may have seen that, and also block prints. Those are recent phenomena. Soapstone sculpture comes to the 1950s, when a missionary brought soapstone from elsewhere and introduced it as something that people could start developing as an art, as a cash activity. And I mean, the reason is you see this big thing he's carrying. Traditionally, Inuit were nomadic people. They lived on a sled. Having a sculpture that big was not a useful thing. What you had were tiny amulets. There's a tradition of carving that was carving tiny, tiny little stone amulets and stuff that you would carry that might have magical properties and be part of shamanistic practice and so on. So this is an example of kind of, again, this evolution of culture. Some of the emblematic things that we think of as being, contemporary Inuit art and so on are very much an adaptation to the current environment. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk to you briefly about the Inuit concepts of mental health and illness, because in describing the way in which culture changes, one of the questions we have again is, so to what extent are people embedded in traditional ways of thinking? To what extent are they just taking part in the same circulation of knowledge? To what extent has the experience of residential schools, or in the case of Inuit, for example, residential schools were not the only important disruption. There was also a lot of tuberculosis in the north, and a lot of young people who were taken away to sanitaria. So you can find it as a nice movie. It's less accurate, more romantic movie, but it has interesting imagery in it called Map of the Human Heart, which is about an Inuit man who comes down to spend time in a sanitarium because he's a boy, because he's diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he falls in love with, I think, a Quebecois or Métis girl, and then it's the sort of lifelong trajectory of their love affair. It's a very romantic film. I mean, anyway. But it does show this other disruptive process where people spent long, long periods of time in hospitals. And so again, another kind of institution, or not hospitals, but these sanitaria, again, which were not normal family environments. So there's an interesting question then, since we're dealing with culture change and transformation all the time, there's a strong tendency to romanticize when you're talking about indigenous people or other cultures, to want to fix them in a certain point in time and treat these older ethnographies as though this is the current world, when it's not. People are really involved in a lot of new things, but still wanting to know. So, but what does get retained or transformed, or what's going on? So we did a project, and this came out of work where, when I was working in the North early on, some of the Inuit community workers said to me, we'd like you to get on the radio, the local, within each village or hamlet, there's an FM radio, and sort of they have like talk shows and music all day long or whatever. We'd like you to get on the radio to tell people that schizophrenia is not caused by demon possession. So I was a bit alarmed by this, because I thought, if I get on the radio, I mean, I sort of agree that it's probably not caused by demon possession, but I don't know what that means to other people, to the Inuit of the community. If I get on the radio and say this, I may be offending everybody in the community, and what's the point? So I said, okay, this is interesting you're saying that. I think we need to know more about what people think schizophrenia is and other things are, and so on. So we basically did a project where we tried to look at local understandings of mental illness. So I offer this to you now both as a story about models, and also a little bit about methodology, or kind of methodology we use. So the scheme we used was to take something that had been developed by Henry Murphy and Ellen Corin from work for WHO, which is to have a set of registers of common types of problems that are considered within what we consider within the domain of mental health. And so the first 11 or so here, first 12 of these were from that list. And the first thing is just a general thing you do with a key informant. You know, can you tell me about mental health problems, or people who are crazy or whatever? That's using the colloquial term, but that's not good enough because that may not mean anything to people. So the others are much more specific, and their behaviors. You know, somebody who's very strange or odd or bizarre, somebody who is speaking in a way that doesn't make sense or seems altered in some way, somebody who sees things that other people can't see, or hears things that other people can't hear. Somebody who's being violent toward others. So they're meant to be minimal descriptions, because you don't want to prejudge what people consider as abnormal or as a problem. And then the idea is to get people to describe to you actual cases or episodes of these, not abstract knowledge, oh, that's what we call so-and-so. But do you know anybody like that? Have you heard of anybody like that? Tell me about that. And you collect those stories. And that gives you a doorway into beginning to get something about local conceptions. So we did this and we added some here at the end. We added lapses of memory, periods of being frozen or mobile, or running wild. So all these were meant to get at Pebloktok, right? Because I mentioned to you before, so there's this literature, and this is before Lyle Dick's papers came out, sort of exploding the myth of Pebloktok to some degree. So we were interested in seeing, does that exist? What would people describe if we gave them the elements of this? And the last one was demon possession, which again came from what I already heard, that some people use that expression, and I need to know, what does that mean? So that's what we did. We interviewed about 80 people. And this is the kind of map we got of the terms and the examples that people gave when we looked at all the case studies, and we tried to put down these explanations and group them in terms of the relationships. And I think I have some slides here now that show these in separate things. First of all, there was no actual term for mental health problem in general, because this was not a single coherent category in people's minds. When pressed, they could make up a term. It's no problem. Inuktitut is an agglutinative language. You have certain roots, and you can make all kinds of words very easily. Usually you split the root and you put things in the middle, so the word gets longer and longer, so which is quite hard when you're learning it. It's quite hard to think that way. It's also, incidentally, you may have come across this myth in anthropology that Inuit have 100 words for snow. This is like every anthropology textbook has this. It's not strictly true. There are basically two roots for snow, one for falling and one for on the ground, but you can make hundreds of phrases in effect about snow, and people do make all those distinctions. People know that this is snow that probably fell a few days ago and has a hard crust, and this is this and this, because this is used for navigating, it's used for lots of things, it's important knowledge. But it's a little bit of a misunderstanding about the grammar of the language, that statement that there are 100 words for snow. In any event, so people made up, when we pressed them to say, okay, we want a word, for general mental health problem, they came up with a word. And in fact, they came up with two words, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce these because my Inuktitut is about nil, but one of which is for a sort of general mental health problem, and then these two words coming off of it, one of which, Ismaluktuk, which basically meant thinking too much or having many heavy thoughts. And isuma is essentially thinking or mind or rationality. It has all those connotations. It's not the brain. The brain, there's a separate word for the brain. And the other word was isuma hangetuk, which was basically like has no mind. So one is like excessive thinking and the other is like no rationality. And then around these, they gave different examples and described, again, what I've marked here are mainly specific behaviors that they were giving, because I was looking for symptoms and signs. How would you concretely describe what this person's doing that tells somebody else, yes, they have this problem? Let me see how the rest of these slides are organized here. So over here we have the isma luktuk, which included things like, somebody who seems very preoccupied, somebody who's very depressed, somebody who is worrying too much. People gave an example like, well, suppose a hunter is out on the land hunting and he's wondering where are the caribou. He could be very preoccupied with that. That could be isma luktuk. But there was also a man that I'd seen in the community who had paranoid schizophrenia from our point of view, who had fixed delusions, and they described him as isma luktuk. So that was very interesting to me because it seemed like it was kind of normalizing in a way. It was kind of putting it on a continuum. The other thing that's important to say about this, and it's true of inuktitut in general, and it's true of most of these terms, is that they are terms for states of mind, not for kinds of people. So whereas in English, it's very easy to go from saying, oh, this person has schizophrenia, to saying, oh, they are a schizophrenic. It's a very unfortunate kind of slide because it then summarizes the whole person under an illness label, and I think that habit of language can have negative, stigmatizing effects because you're ignoring every other aspect of the person at that point. In Inuktitut, it's much harder to say that because in effect you're forced to say this person is in such and such state of mind, and their state of mind could change. It could be different tomorrow. If you want to say that they're always in that state of mind, you have to go to that effort. You have to sort of really make that point. So it probably encourages people to think in more process-oriented terms and to view the possibility that somebody could get better or could be in a different state of mind the next day or differently. So that was one interesting thought we had, that maybe there was some benefit from that way of thinking that would protect people from a certain amount of stigma. The other cluster of things people talked about that were showing more lack of rationality or lack of coherence or trouble explaining people's behavior clustered a whole bunch of things here, and you see we've got weird, strange behaviors, throwing things, looking different, very active. So you've got lots of positive symptoms of psychosis and so on. But also, that's where demon possession appeared. And two other things, Wirtselik and Nuliartslik. So Wirtselik and Nuliartslik were described to us as, that's a situation where someone has a spirit fiancé or a spirit spouse. And those are the terms that are used for a fiancé, male or female fiancé. And so this is an idea people express that there are some people who maybe seem to be talking to themselves or stay by themselves all the time, and what's really going on is that they have a spirit spouse. And the theory of how this could develop is if you really long for somebody passionately and you have your image of the person you're longing for, that mental image could attract a kind of wandering spirit that could come to inhabit that. So it's an interesting kind of psychological notion in a way that, obsessing, about somebody could actually lead to a being coming and being there. And it's also interesting to think that this might represent a kind of persistence of a much older idea, whereas a lot of the other ideas people talked about sounded very contemporary. This could be the persistence perhaps of something connected to shamanistic ideas and so on, complex Inuit ontology of the person. And you would believe that there are different kinds of soul in a person. There's a kind of breath soul that's the vital energy, but there's a name soul that comes with the name you're given. And Inuit traditionally had a practice of saunik, where you were given the name of someone who died, and you therefore became in part that person, to the extent that other people would then call you by the relation name. So if I have a child and I name it after your grandmother, you would then call that child grandmother. And you now have a relationship with that child as, in a sense, being your grandmother. And this practice exists to this day, and it's a way of forming meaningful connections between people. People will take care with each other. People will say, I got to go visit my grandfather, and this person's going and they visit a little child. And they don't have big conversations like their grandfather's there, but they feel a connection or kinship and a certain level of responsibility. So it's an interesting way to weave people together in the tradition. But you see demon possession also. So when we ask, well, what do you mean demon possession? Well, they mean Satan possession. What do you mean Satan? Well, there's a passage in the Bible on the Gadarene swine where this person is possessed and Jesus casts out the spirit and it goes into the swine who run off the cliff, and that's the exorcism. So this is something that has taken the shape now, whatever its older roots are. It now looks very much like a contemporary Christian, Pentecostal, whatever kind of notion of being possessed by the devil, and for which exorcism can be helpful. So that also is circulating those ideas and exist among Inuit. And this work done 20 years ago. I think these things are still around. Maybe the prevalence has changed and the position has changed. So the final point I want to make about this, though, is that these ideas, so then if you talk to somebody that we're working with, a community worker or somebody else, and we say, okay, so this person has schizophrenia, how do you understand that? They would say, well, schizophrenia, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, right? And you say, well, what do you think causes that? Well, maybe not getting enough love when you're young, or having trauma or adversity. And then we would say, well, do you think, some people have talked about Satan, demon possession, do you think that could have any role? And people would say, oh yes, demon possession could cause that. So what you have is, and I think this is an important general message, not about Inuit now, because I say this is old information, it's just a few people I'm talking about now. Don't take this home as a generalization about Inuit. But the lesson from this is a very important lesson about the nature of cultural explanatory models in the contemporary world. Because the average person had several models available, which from the point of view of a Western trained mental health practitioner would seem to be very incompatible models. I mean, which is it now? Is it demon possession or chemical imbalance? Choose, and one is scientific and one is not, et cetera, et cetera. The same people, and often very educated, very knowledgeable people, would have more than one model, which they would use depending upon which question you were asking. Do you want to know about what is going on in the brain? Okay, I can tell you what I know about that. Do you want to know what socio-moral dimensions are of this problem? Okay, I have a different framework for thinking about that, because frankly, the chemical thing in the brain tells you nothing about the socio-moral thing. It says it's outside that frame completely. Don't even ask that. It doesn't matter. So it doesn't answer that question for people. So if you're going to ask that kind of question, well, you need a different framework. So I think this is an important take-home message here, that most people, or many people in different contexts, use multiple frames of reference that may come from different strands, that may well be aware of biomedical views and other things. They all watch TV and read books and have exposure to the same ideas that are circulating in popular media and so on. But they're making use of them to solve different questions and different problems. And so I think if we're going to deal with mental health literacy or negotiation with people around things, we have to respect that fact, because we might have a very good conversation around one thing and feel we're seeing completely eye to eye, and miss the fact that there are whole other domains of knowledge that people have that they're going to use in other contexts that we're unaware of and we're not engaging. Okay, I want to say a few words. Actually, we're supposed to stop in 15 minutes. Is that right? I think that's right. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. I want to say a few words about the work on resilience that we've been doing. And this came out of the earlier work on suicide because of concern about the fact that, given the level of these mental health problems, that the research that does go on in Indigenous communities has been focused a lot on problems and deficiencies, and it sort of holds up a mirror to the communities that can be very demoralizing for people. So there was a push coming from the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health. We have in Canada a whole, one of our 13 health research institutes is devoted to Aboriginal health, and they had a program to support work on resilience. And so we did a number of projects in different communities looking at Indigenous notions of resilience. And the way we approach this with the communities, we had a community researcher in each case working with people from outside in partnership. And as we developed the project, what we presented to people was, we're interested in understanding how your own community understands those people who've done well despite adversity. So we don't use the word resilience, which is again kind of a technical word, but just simply people who have had, many people have had hard times, the whole community has faced hard times. how have certain people or certain communities done well, certain families done well despite that? Can we understand? Is there a language for that? Are there ideas about that and so on? So that's what we've been studying these different communities. And there are at least these 4 things that have come up across different communities that we thought were important to draw out. And we've already talked a little bit about the first, which is this notion of connection to land and place. There's a very moving film that was done in Australia. Helen Milroy is an Aboriginal psychiatrist, child psychiatrist in Perth. And her mother, Gladys, was a very strong woman and had very successful children. Another one of Helen's siblings is Sally Morgan is a very successful writer, novelist, autobiographical novelist, and her book about her childhood experiences became like standard reading in Australian schools. Another daughter who's head of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia did a film about their mother and about her search for her roots. It's a documentary called Glad, which is, I guess, the nickname, Gladys's nickname. And in this movie, she tries to trace her roots, going up country, kind of back through different more rural areas in Western Australia, and finding the traces of the thing. And the story is very, very painful. I mean, because it's a story of colonial domination, of exploitation, of sexual violence. There's a lot of difficult things in part of that history. And at one point they sort of reach almost a dead end, that they can trace it so far back and it's back to a very painful story and it's hard to know what to do with this. And then they arrive at a point where they find a certain tree. And Gladys realizes, this is my birth tree. This is where the placenta was buried at the base of this tree. And she is connected to this tree. And she feels this deep sense of comfort and connection suddenly. That she has a place, that she has a root, that she has a kind of psychic center. So again, it's a profound expression of a kind of ecocentric self that also helps to solve a problem of the disruption of the continuity of family and so on that people would equally expect to have and hope to have, but because of the whole experience of violence, of colonization and its aftermath has been disrupted. And I think it's a very compelling example, again, of that kind of possibility to connect to what in the West would be called nature. But again, when you use the word nature with indigenous people, they sometimes scratch their heads. So they're saying, what do you mean nature? What is other than nature? You know, because the nature-culture opposition is not built into most indigenous models of the universe. We are part of whatever you want to call nature, so it doesn't occur as a discrete category in that way. But this notion of the power connected to place and to this particular, in this case, this living thing of this tree was very compelling when you see it, very moving when you see it connected that way. The second strand that's very distinctive for indigenous people is this recuperation, revitalization of language and tradition. Because of the history of colonization having actively suppressed people's identities, being forbidden to practice their religion. There were laws enacted to prevent things like potlatch and Sundance and other things across the country. Because of all these layers, as I mentioned, people are quite explicit in saying what was taken away from us was our culture. We want our culture back. Culture is the cure. Culture is the medicine that will restore our sense of identity and collectivity and vision of who we are. So it's quite specific in that way. And connected to that, again, the vehicle for culture is the oral tradition, storytelling, ritual enactment, and so on. And finally, the notion that people are living in a contemporary world where all of this is highly politicized, and being able to be politically active, to give voice to that in some way, is an effective way to speak back to these things. So I'm going to skip this here. And I just want to end with two small things to tell you. So this is a scene from Ecocentric, which is a Mi'kmaq community in Cape Breton Island. It's an interesting ecosystem because it's at the junction of seawater and freshwater. So you have very special kinds of fish and plants and everything else that live in that environment. And there's a rich language for this in Mi'kmaq. and we were part of a workshop where elders were trying to teach young people some of this language, because again, there's a very special vocabulary which, to the extent that people are not involved anymore in certain kinds of fishing and other things, they don't necessarily use this kind of language. At the same time is that this represents very local, specific knowledge. You also have knowledge that's circulating in indigenous communities as part of revitalization that is part of pan-Indian knowledge. So you may have encountered people talking about the medicine wheel, for example, this idea that all of human experience involves sort of a balance between 4 quadrants or 4 kinds of experience: mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And this is often presented as this is native spirituality. I mean, those ideas come out of very specific tradition at a particular point in time, have been very much elaborated in recent times, and are now circulated across very different communities. So this is from the same region, a workshop being put on by a man who has learned the medicine wheel as a way of talking about Mi'kmaq spirituality. And he's now talking about a kind of diagnosis of our contemporary world as being out of balance, with overdevelopment of mind and of body, and underdevelopment of the emotional and the spiritual. And that this is a kind of diagnosis of the value problems in society, and how are we going to refine this balance. At the same time, there are new forms of spirituality that build on the past and deal with the contemporary world. So this is Elizabeth Marshall, a colleague and Mi'kmaq teacher. And she told a fascinating story about Mi'kmaq, as part of our work on resilience, Mi'kmaq notions of spirituality that she was participating in terms of a new tradition that built on the past, that argues that the Mi'kmaq, before the Europeans came, before the missionaries came and so on, had their own spiritual system and culture, teachers and so on. And in particular, they had a notion of 3 crosses. There are petroglyphs in the region, old crosses carved on stone that antedate the Europeans. And so maybe they represent Norse things, or maybe they represent ancient Mi'kmaq things, but those images are there. And so in this tradition, they're understood as the teachings related to the 3 crosses, which, and this is the now teaching of the 3 crosses. The crosses stand for safe journey, wise counsel, and full provision. When the Mi'kmaq signed treaties with the Europeans, they were not treaties signing over their land. They were peace and friendship treaties. And in effect, the Mi'kmaq said, because you Europeans are like children here in this land, you don't know how to survive in this land, we will share our knowledge with you and take care of you. And this is what we're agreeing to do now, to share things. And when one of the chiefs signed this thing, he said to the Europeans, I see now that you are a human being. Because they're able to enter into this kind of basic human experience of reciprocity and mutual respect. So this is a different way of talking about the experience of colonization that is a little more egalitarian, a little more level playing field. And it takes on particular significance when you understand how some people can live this out in the contemporary world. So when the attacks on the Twin Towers occurred in New York City in 9/11, there were some Mi'kmaq workers in Boston watching this, and they said to each other, we have to go to Manhattan to help the white man because of our treaties. That's very powerful, to me, stays a very powerful story of, because we've been talking so much today about downtrodden indigenous people and how they got, hammered by the European colonizers. Here's a way of retelling and rethinking your history and what it means in the contemporary world that says, look, we are centered on issues of fairness, of exchange, of obligation, and we have a moral obligation to help the vulnerable people who came here. So, you go from being the downtrodden to being the moral hero in this situation. And I think this is an interesting, when you think about how do people recuperate a tradition, because one of the great violences that was done against indigenous people was the invaders who came here said, this is empty land. There was a doctrine of terra nullius. This is empty land, therefore we just claim this. We claim this for the Queen of England or the King of France or whatever. There's no problem because there's nobody here. And along with that went the notion, okay, there are these primitive people here, but they have almost no culture. they have almost nothing of interest here. Look, they barely clothe, et cetera, et cetera. So there was no ability to see the richness of people's lifeways, their moral systems, their mythological systems, their complex material technology, all the things, the knowledge of the environment, all the things existed there. People were mostly oblivious to. It's not entirely true. There were historians, recorders, even missionaries who were sensitive and who were recording this stuff and supporting it and doing what they could. But the overall, response was profoundly blind to what was going on. So that has left another historical wound, because it's one thing to say, I come from a proud people and we're temporarily oppressed, but we have this great history. We invented algebra, or we invented paper and fireworks, or whatever it is that you could bring forward, versus no, there's nothing here, there's no prehistory. These are people without history. So we'll just bring them up from the state of nothingness into some kind of thing. That is a very violent act in terms of people having any sense of historical continuity, identity, and so on. So the story I'm telling you now is one part, along with some of the other things we talked about, of trying to reframe that history and understand that history in a very different way that accords the appropriate dignity and respect for the complex trajectories and richness of the traditions of the languages and so on. There's so many fascinating things about indigenous languages. Inuktitut, for example, is inflected in such a way that by the conjugation and when you're describing something, you can tell what level of familiarity you have with that information. Did you see it with your own eyes? Did somebody else tell you, or did somebody else tell them? It's very sophisticated epistemological information that's encoded into language that's very relevant if you're a hunter and you're trying to figure out, where are the caribou, and somebody's giving you a piece of information, right away, in a sense, how reliable is information, or where am I going to go with this, and so on. So there's all kinds of richness in these languages and stuff like this, which again, unless you are deeply embedded, you can't make much use of. So I'm just ending here with this diagram that harkens back to the earlier discussion of us talking about this transgenerational transmission and how it goes on at different levels and different processes, and how are we going to reverse this? So we have a process of the individuals who've been affected by the violence and who are recovering from that in different ways. We have whole families that have suffered this, and so their dynamics has changed. We have whole communities that have suffered this, and so the community has been destabilized in ways. And we have nations, and the whole language of First Nations is to reassert that sense of nationhood and stability. And there may even be another level, a biological level of what's happening at the level of child rearing and so on, that is impressing itself on people's response to stress and so on. And the question is, what is going to address that? So we now have an ongoing process of recognizing Indigenous people. We have it within Canada, and we have it internationally. We have institutions within Canada, some of which unfortunately are being dismantled right now, but hopefully many of which will survive and be rebuilt. We had this historical process that I mentioned. In Montreal, we had around 1990 a crisis with the community of Kanesatake and Oka, where the city of Oka wanted to build a golf course on a sacred area, burial ground, and the community protested, and they blocked the bridges into the city, and that was called out the military. A person was killed. It was a very intense standoff. What it led to was a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which collected this testimony about the residential schools and so on. That led to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which dispersed $350,000 for projects on healing. And that led to an ongoing process. Right now, we're in the midst of it still, which is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in Canada, we've had a formal apology 4 years ago. The Prime Minister made this apology. I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in these schools is a sad chapter in our history. For more than a century, Indian residential schools separated over 150,000 Aboriginal children from their families and communities. And this goes on. I mean, the record in Hansard goes on for some paragraphs where he describes this in some detail. And this was an important step. It's a meaningful step. But of course, the dynamics of apology and forgiveness are complex. And at the end, I think, what does it say? He says here, reconciliation is an ongoing process. And this is the dilemma right now, because I think, in all honesty, the government did this with a hope that now we can turn the page. There were so many lawsuits at play against the residential schools that if even a fraction of them had been successful, it would have bankrupted all the churches in Canada. So there was definitely a lot of pressure on the government and on other social institutions to find some resolution to this conflict, which had come to a head because of people becoming fully aware of the scope of the violence that had been done. And so in the effort to resolve this and move on, there's the tension between the individual need for people to sort through their own suffering and make sense of it, and the political desire to just come up with a fair and equitable resolution and move on. And the dynamics of, acknowledgement of violence, of apology, of and so on, and are that it takes time, and it implies a new kind of relationship. It implies a kind of acceptance of a certain ongoing vulnerability, reciprocity, redistribution of power. And that's unfinished business at the present time. This is a last image from John Ralston Saul, a Canadian philosopher, husband of a former Governor General, arguing that Canada fundamentally is a Métis nation, that although we talk about ourselves as having two founding peoples, French and English, that actually if you look back at the early political discussions, people were borrowing language from the treaties, from the kind of treaty I mentioned before with the Mi'kmaq. There was a peace and friendship treaty, because the language of those treaties was a fairness and trade and exchange. And he argues that if you look at the British and French political traditions, they don't use the same metaphors. There's different language. That's present in Canadian language too, but we have this other strand, this other set of metaphors, other set of concepts about reciprocity, about fairness, which most Canadians would see as, yeah, that's a very Canadian thing. You got to be fair and try to run our society in a fair way. The endorsement of things like socialized medicine and so on in comparison to the US is often couched in that kind of language. And he argues that much of that comes exactly from indigenous negotiations and language, and that if we acknowledge that, it'd be a little bit more like the New Zealand situation now of sort of saying, okay, this is central to our identity, so why don't we respect this and draw strength from this. So I think it's an interesting way to think about the future and how people are going to go forward with Indigenous identity, and ultimately this idea that people are going to end up with a kind of rooted cosmopolitanism. And we all have to become cosmopolitan in a way, because that's the world we're living in. We can't afford to just live in our little blinkered world, but we also all need a sense of roots of connection. So maybe this is going to be some form of this in the future that will allow some kind of Indigenous identity to continue at the same time as people are hooked into the global network. And in terms of economic viability, that's probably where remote communities might eventually be economically viable, is with a kind of fully electronic village kind of world. And so the future might look something like that.